So now we're moving to the keynote session of our programming, and I'm really delighted to introduce our next speaker because she is going to continue to contribute to our theme and the multiple conversations that we've had about diversity and equity with respect to not just the arts but across the country. Lois Vossen is with us today, and she's the executive producer of Independent Lens. And she's been with the show since its inception as a primetime series at PBS. Lois is responsible for commissioning new films, programming the series, and working with filmmakers on editorial and broadcast issues. And she does this all through the lens of diversity. Now, Independent Lens has received 17 Emmy Awards, 16 George Foster Peabody Awards, 5 Alfred I. DuPont Columbia Journalism Awards, and has been nominated for 8 Academy Awards. I'm delighted that she's here today. I'm also delighted to report that she's a fellow Midwesterner. We shared a little conversation about how when you get back to the Midwest, you find all these people that have the same kind of accent as you. So please join me in welcoming Lois to the stage.
Thank you all, and thank you, Jane. It's true, if I start to talk like Marge Gunderson from Fargo, you'll forgive me. I'm going to set a clock here just to make sure I don't go on too long. I work for a nonprofit media company called ITVS. Stands for Independent Television Service, and the organization opened its doors in 1991 with diversity as our mandate. We were founded specifically to bring diversity to public television. So the topic you asked me to come and speak on is something we're all very passionate about. I am extremely pleased to be with you all today, a group of people who have spent their careers celebrating arts and education, because for me, that is exactly where my knowledge about why diversity matters began. I grew up on a small dairy farm, and trust me, I'm not going to go back in time and repeat my entire childhood, but I grew up on a small dairy farm in rural Minnesota. It was a great place to grow up, but it was homogenous, a very self-contained world. Everybody was white, Christian, and either German or Scandinavian. The biggest difference was if somebody was a Catholic or a Lutheran, with the occasional outlier, a Presbyterian. To say it was homogenous is an understatement. But it was through images on television that I saw that there were different people and different kinds of beliefs in the world. And this was back in the 60s and 70s, when television wasn't exactly a land of great diversity. But television was the dominant connection that existed to the world outside of Watkins. And it began to open my eyes to new people, to new experiences. I'm sure it's one of the reasons I'm here today to talk about what I do, to make sure that television represents the real face of America, so other young people can see themselves and their communities related back to them. Most of the people I knew, including my family, thought of art as something over there. It was something rare and special that only rare and special people got to do. Looking back now, I realize we had art, like the doilies my mom embroidered, but nobody identified those things as art. Art was something remote and far removed, something for wealthy people to enjoy. It wasn't until I was influenced by high school teachers that I began to see art as something that we could all claim as part of our lives. Theater was the most unattainable art. I remember we took a class trip to see a college production of Alice in Wonderland, and it further reinforced that art was something over there, but at least for that brief moment, I got to be over there with it. Then in high school, I was lucky enough to get a new theater teacher, Mr. May. Our town was 2 hours away from the nearest theater, so obviously theater wasn't something I ever thought about. But Mr. May instilled in us that theater was a place where you could learn and be entertained. And I began to see it as a place where you could move people emotionally and help them see something beyond what they already knew. So whether it was a musical or a serious play that took on important issues like A Raisin in the Sun, I started to look at art as a way to change people's perceptions. For me, it became a bridge. It took me to distant places and made them present. It took something historical and made it current. I began to realize with plays like A Raisin in the Sun that a woman named Lorraine Hansberry, who was writing in 1959 in New York City about a poor African-American family living on Chicago's South Side, was relevant to my own life. The characters lived thousands of miles away and were decades removed from my own life experience, and yet they somehow felt close to me. Their lives, their struggles, and most importantly, their dreams were something that I could relate to. There was a recognition that my family wasn't as far removed from the younger family as maybe I was taught to believe. We had something in common. Imagine then how excited I was when 4 decades later, ITVS was able to fund the first documentary film about the writer Lorraine Hansberry and the impact of her work with our film, Lorraine Hansberry, Sighted Eyes, Feeling Heart. It brought my life full circle, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Back in high school, my English teacher, Mr. Broughton, taught us poetry by having us study the lyrics of Bob Dylan and the Beatles, as well as E.E. Cummings and Emily Dickinson. Another light bulb went off. You mean the music I listened to could be art? That was powerful because it meant that art was accessible and enjoyable, and again was introducing me to people that I would never otherwise have encountered. This was really exciting for a high school student who loved school, but it still made me realize that to be involved in making art, to make my living as someone who made art, was completely remote. It was beyond the realm of my thinking to tell my hardworking dairy farmer parents that I wanted to go to college and major in theater. Although I was raised in a loving community, we were taught to dream small. And I quickly decided that I couldn't be an artist myself. That was simply too risky. But again, when I went to college, it was a teacher who helped me see a different path. One of my college jobs was doing publicity for the theater department and the plays that we put on. And my theater advisor helped me design a new degree called Arts Administration. At that point, I didn't see any possibility that I could work in film or television. That was for people who lived in that very remote place called Hollywood, off in that very remote place called California. But maybe I could find another way to help artists who wanted to tell stories. And my new arts administration degree pointed me in the right direction. I had made many strong professors, including Rena Cohen, who I realized years later was the mother of the famous Coen brothers filmmaking team. But it was during my junior year of college that I was the most fortunate because I got to go on a 3-month fine arts tour in Europe. And Mrs. Cohen was my art history professor. That experience was like somebody lifting off the top of my head and just pouring things into my brain every day. New languages, the visual arts, architecture, music, exceptional theater in the great cities of Europe, London, Paris, Florence, Rome, Munich. It was wonderfully intoxicating and a bit overwhelming, but I had worked 2 jobs to get there, and looking back, it's the best money I ever invested in myself, because it literally opened up half the world to me. And that trip inspired me to see myself in a future I had never imagined. So that's how I came to see the importance of art. But why am I standing here today to talk about diversity? Why do I know that it is vital to hear the stories of people who are different from us? Well, my second job after college was as the program director of The Loft, a writer's center for poets and fiction writers in Minneapolis. That's where my real education on diversity began. One year I decided we needed to diversify our classes and I should offer creative writing classes taught by Native American poets. So I got really excited and I lined up the classes and I lined up the teachers and I hustled to make sure the classes had full enrollment. And then it became the week for classes to start, late September, and I showed up and I had a room full of students and no teacher. And when I called the Native American poet, he reminded me that he had said it wasn't a good idea to start that week. He was afraid that week would be the week that they would need to harvest the wild rice crop. And he went by a calendar that nature dictated. So something again clicked. Having grown up on a farm, I knew what it meant to have to harvest the crops when it was time to do so. We weren't supposed to work on Sundays, for example, but if it was going to rain, it meant we baled hay. And if it was going to frost, it meant we harvested the grain. So the Native American poet that I had hired did me the courtesy of teaching me an important reminder about how essential it is to understand and to honor other cultures. I remember realizing that he was a lot like my parents, that he operated on a calendar that was unique to the work he did, and how important it was that if I had listened to him, I would have saved myself a major embarrassment of having to teach a Native American poetry class. Often when we talk about diversity, the conversation assumes that the way things are now is down here somewhere, and diversity is up here or over there, a kind of world peace, idealistic and unnatural utopia that we strive for but really can never attain. But in reality, we know the world, as it is right now, is a diverse place. We don't have to make it diverse. It is diverse. It's actually the walls of exclusion and the structures of power that we have built to keep people out that are the artificial thing. My colleagues and I at ITVS talk a lot about inclusivity rather than diversity. Our effort is to take down, and sometimes that means to break down, the walls that make it not possible for every person to have the same right to tell their story and be heard. What diversity means to me personally and to our organization is that plurality in our society is something we value and celebrate. Being part of a nation of immigrants means that we're part of a country built on the beliefs, traditions, and strengths of many different kinds of people. A true and strong democracy welcomes the exchange of all its people so that we have the best ideas coming forward. That can only happen when all people and all groups are not marginalized or left out of the conversation. And art plays an integral role in our democracy, as you all know so well. It ensures that we have an informed and educated public. Our job at ITVS, and specifically with my series Independent Lens, is to embrace diversity and to amplify stories from many different people. We think about it as a way to introduce people, our viewers, all across the country to communities and cultures that they would never otherwise meet. We champion inclusivity by seeking out and supporting filmmakers from many communities: African American, Latino, Muslim, Native American, the disabled, Asian American, the elderly. 72% of our money goes to filmmakers of color, and 65% of that content is about diverse communities. And 51% of our programs are made by female directors, because diversity is a gender issue too. We focus on supporting diverse artists because we believe who is telling the story is important. It's wonderful that we all want to tell and share each other's stories, but it's critical that we support artists who can tell a story from their own lives, from their own neighborhoods, rather than have someone parachute in from the outside and tell their story for them. Our imperative is to amplify independent voices, and it's paramount when you look at the mainstream media and consider what stories get privileged, who's controlling the lens, who's asking the questions, and who's editing what voices we hear. A few years ago, I commissioned the acclaimed filmmaker Stanley Nelson to do a film on the Black Panthers. Stanley is an African American, and he spent years gaining the trust of the people whose stories he wanted to tell, people who were used to having their story co-opted. One of the experiences that I remember vividly is one day we were filming an elderly former Black Panther and talking about violence that he had encountered when he was a young man growing up in Oakland, California in the 50s and 60s. He was talking about an incident when a young man was shot by the police and the Panthers showed up to protest. Stanley asked him, well, you guys were outnumbered that day and in all reality probably should have died. What were you thinking? Without missing a beat, the man said to Stanley, I never felt more free because I was fighting for something I believed in, something that was bigger than me. He said those words, which were his truth, because he was talking to another Black man, someone who had experienced what it meant to be a Black man in this culture. His honest and very specific response was because he trusted the storyteller who would take it away and share it with the world. I'm not saying that only Black people can make films about Black experiences or anything remotely like that. But I do believe that it's essential that we let people tell their own stories so that we get the most authentic story as often as we can. At ITVS and Independent Lens, we work to include diversity at every stage of our process, including who makes the decisions, how we talk and work with filmmakers, and how we even talk about the films themselves. Right now, for example, there's a growing controversy in our field about the fact that most film festival programmers are white and predominantly male, and as a result, most of the programming that gets selected represents a small portion of who we are as Americans. So it does matter who the gatekeepers are because it impacts the choices we make. At Independent Lens, for example, my co-programmer is a man named Noland Walker. Noland is a very smart, very articulate African-American man who grew up in Memphis. Our childhoods and backgrounds couldn't be more different. But when we come together to talk about films, it's an incredible experience, I think, for both of us. We see each other's blind spots, and we teach each other and help each other find and support and make an amazing array of films by a diverse group of filmmakers, because we're looking at it from our own unique lens. Last year, for example, I found a film that was about rural Kentucky, and I fell in love with it. Of course, a farm girl. I loved the film that looked at the history of farmers who were losing their land. But when talking to Noland, I had an aha moment, because Noland quickly pointed out that as good as the film was, there was nothing in the film about the history of African American farmers in rural Kentucky. Although the film didn't change into something else, my conversation with Noland convinced me to go back to the filmmaker and talk about how we could incorporate that history into the film to make it a more nuanced portrait, so that when viewers watched that film, they had the full story and not just a small slice of the story. In other words, to show them the diversity that was already there. That experience was a reminder about why it's critical for me to work with people who have different backgrounds and are from different parts of the country and have had different experiences, because their experiences and their perspectives make things visible that to me were once invisible. So if we agree that every story and individual has an important story to tell, then we need to do more than open a door. We need to take down the wall that makes it impossible for those stories to be valued. At ITVS, we created something called the Diversity Development Fund 15 years ago. The idea was that we wanted to support and fund young filmmakers who were just beginning to identify themselves as artists, and give them a chance to develop their stories and find a way to support them as they became a full-fledged filmmaker. Each year we identify 20 to 25 young filmmakers and give them a small amount of money to formulate their idea and to go through what we call R&D. Then we hope the project can be strengthened so that they can effectively apply for additional funding and larger amounts of production funds so that they can make their documentary or digital series. I'm happy to say that after doing this for 15 years, a very large percentage of those projects end up getting fully funded and getting broadcast on Independent Lens and other PBS series. And it reinforces, as my colleague who just spoke to me talked about, that you have to be in it for the long haul and you have to give people something to shoot for, something to aim for higher than what they already know. So diversity and inclusion efforts are not just external. At ITVS, our board is 67% people of color, our staff is more than 60% diverse, and we hold ourselves, or try to hold ourselves, accountable to diversity in all aspects of the organization, even down to the vendors we hire to do our closed captioning or the caterers we bring in when we have an event. But like every place, we fall short, and we need to be reminded, and we need to hold ourselves accountable. Recently, at one of our ITVS all-staff meetings, two of my colleagues were giving a great presentation about our viewership, and they were breaking down who's watching Independent Lens, what groups, what age demographic, and finally one of my colleagues raised her hand, and Monica said she was curious why the Nielsen ratings audience graph only listed white, black, and other. She articulated how a binary black-white system literally rendered her community invisible. And she challenged all of us to consider how we could claim that we serve communities of color if our graphs didn't even represent those communities of color. It took a lot of courage for my colleague Monica to put herself out there, even in what I think is a pretty safe environment, because it's always hard to challenge the status quo, even, and maybe especially, when you're challenging your friends and the people you respect. A lot of us were stunned. We were stunned that the rating system didn't provide more information that reflected who we are as a country, but I think we were also equally stunned that we had accepted this invisibility that resulted and how it made people feel and how it made us less aware. So, my colleagues and I got up and went over and gave Monica a hug, and we thanked her for reminding us that diversity is our mandate and that it's our job to make sure people like her hold us accountable. I had a similar wake-up call a few years ago when I participated in a festival panel called Docs So White. On the panel with me was a filmmaker named Darius Clark Monroe. And Darius and I had worked previously on his wonderful documentary called Evolution of a Criminal. He's an incredibly smart, articulate man, and it really startled me when he commented that he had become increasingly quiet and hesitant to talk about the lack of diversity on the film festival circuit, because he felt he would be silenced professionally and creatively. That actually scared me, because I thought, if somebody like Darius can be silenced, what does it say about this community I work in? What does this say about a community that's supposed to be free-thinking and inclusive and leading the vanguard, and yet we're afraid to have somebody criticize our blind spots? It's clear to me that I had the ability to forget, to walk away, to not have to be constantly aware of the fact that not everybody is included or asked to tell their story. I sit in a place of privilege. At times in my career, working at the different wonderful organizations I've had the pleasure to work at, I've been able to participate in workshops, undoing racism workshops specifically, and they've all provided me with different aha moments when I've had to stop and say, that simply never occurred to me because I'm not somebody who has lived that experience or had that happen to me. So I've had the good fortune of learning these hard lessons in a gentle way by having people gently coax me toward a deeper understanding. Not everybody is that lucky. A lot of people comment on what a great job I have, and they're right. I have a great job, but I'm always surprised by how much time I spend every day talking to people about diversity and the importance of inclusion. Because I think sometimes we mistake progress for success. History moves in an arc. It's not a straight line. And we're still working on that more perfect union. As the writer James Baldwin said, I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. So I too am an optimist. I have to believe, and I do believe, that we as individuals and as a country will continue to get better and to embrace diversity and demand inclusion. I think we're in a reset moment right now. A lot is happening, and you can't have growth without some pain, and we're certainly having growing pains. The Me Too and the Time's Up movements are putting a spotlight on gender diversity. Every day, another person is being held accountable, and that is hopefully helping all of us create more gender parity and work environments that are not hostile to any of our colleagues. Women and men are working together to create healthier workplaces, and that's an improvement, and that's a giant leap forward. Some people worry maybe we'll go too far. I just read an article with the very funny actor Woody Harrelson, and he talked about how nervous he was that we're not going to hug each other, that we're stopping each other from embracing. I don't really worry about that. I think that most of us will continue to hug each other because we grasp what is appropriate and what is inappropriate, and we know that we may be held accountable. So the status quo no longer becomes the status quo. I believe this is a time of a new social movement for greater accountability. We're at a difficult time, and we've had a difficult history, but we continue to reconcile, and part of that reconciliation is inclusivity. All people exist in their own experiences and face challenges of their own unique world. But arguing only from our own perspective will not reduce anyone's fear or suffering. And the truth is that everyone, no matter how woke or well-intentioned, is limited. No one can speak for the experience of all women, or all immigrants, or all LGBTQ people, even if we're a part of that community. We're all limited by our own perspectives and our own experiences. But luckily, we all have blind spots that are shaped a little differently. As a young person growing up in Minnesota, I began to imagine a larger world through the images I saw on television, then through the music, theater, and art that I got to experience. Once we recognize our own blind spots, we can begin to seek out those people whose visions complement our own and who fill in where we need to know more. As we look around, it's not just what we see, but what we can't see. Who isn't there? What stories aren't being heard? And what are the structures or walls that keep people out? Rather than shouting over and silencing each other, we want to invite into our communities, our workplaces, our schools, government, media, an ever wider array of voices. Together, by filling in where we each lack, we begin to recognize and create a justice and a full diversity. Thank you again for inviting me. I'm someone who has benefited from having great education, specifically great arts education in both high school and college. The work you all do every day at your organization helps people with new ideas and new ways and tools to tell their own stories. Most of the filmmakers, I would actually venture to say all of the filmmakers I work with at Independent Lens have benefited from an arts organization like the ones you all support or work at. People there encourage them to pursue their love of photography, writing, storytelling, and encourage them to tell stories to a larger and larger audience. I assure you that the work you do does matter, and it does change lives. It certainly changed mine. So I want to thank the National Endowment for the Arts and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and all the organizations that support organizations like mine and yours so that we can do the work we do. And thank you all so much for having me today. I hope you enjoy the film.
So thank you, Lois. Many of your remarks truly resonated with this audience, and in particular, your closing remarks around storytelling are certainly aligned with many of the things we talked about as this group continues to share its successes and challenges.